Right, I think that's us recording now, Ali. Yes.
Oh,
welcome to Glasgow. Welcome to Glasgow, Ali Whitelock.
Magi Gibson.
And we're both poets, and we spend a lot of our time, both online and in person.
Some might say too much time.
Talking poetry, and we thought it would be lovely to share, to record some of it and share it, so that if anyone wants to hear two poets and what they chat about so much, then you can join us. So Bukowski, because I know Bukowski had a huge influence on you when you started to write.
He
is that
did.
right?
He did. The influence that he had on me was really that you could say whatever you wanted on the page.
Yes.
You could. There were no holds barred. There was nothing off limits, and I just thought, wow, this is extraordinary, and that really gave me permission, or gave myself permission, to just write whatever I wanted on the page. But I came to Bukowski also not through his poetry, but through his prose, his collections of short stories, and I know that some people might have issues about how he is as a man.
Yeah, well, I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not. I absolutely. I mean, when he hits it right with the poem, he hits it right, and he does that thing which we've spoken about before, which is that for both of us, I think, don't want to speak for you, but I think we've talked about this. It's the emotional punch. If we get the emotional punch first, the poem is working for us, and that emotional punch can come in lots of guises, because it doesn't have to be that violent, doesn't have to be, oh, I'm going to burst into tears, but there's an emotional connection, is maybe a better word. I certainly get that from his work.
Yeah, I don't get that from a lot of his poetry, but I do get it from some, as we said. But you know, in terms of his behaviour as a man, somehow I kind of was able to just I wouldn't say I overlook it, but I was very conscious of it. But it actually never bothered me. It never stopped me loving his work. But I do know that some women don't want to go there.
Yeah, and it's quite understandable. I mean, he does refer to taking whores up to his apartment and that type of thing, and it's quite difficult to take some of that description. But some of the stuff about, for example, the one that sticks in my mind is the one about the goldfish. But I've not looked at it recently.
I remember it.
Right. That's great. I thought it was one of his most famous ones.
Maybe it is.
The goldfish and the mother, and you realise by the end that his mother is putting up with terrible violence. At least that's the way I remember it. And isn't that a funny thing about the way, for each of us individually, what sticks with us about any poem is going to be a bit different.
Absolutely.
For individuals. So why do you think that happens?
I don't know, but we were talking about this the other day, and talking about how you might read a poem and someone will come to you after it and say, you know, what a great poem, it really touched me, that poem about your father or whatever, but in fact it wasn't about your father at all, it was about something completely different. So at the end of the day, when the poem goes out there and it lands in someone's ears and heart, it's for whatever the poem is for them, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, because it's the life experience. Poetry isn't all an intellectual word game. It's not about being really clever. For me, it's not about being really clever on the page with words, although there's that aspect to it. And I love when people are clever with words, but what I need from a poem, for me to love that poem or to me to come back to that poet, is more than anything that I feel that I'm getting, it's hit home, as I've said before, in some kind of emotional way where it touches me at a deep level. And you're quite right that I have had strange experiences as well of people coming up to me. And the one which sticks in my mind, and I usually use as an example, is after a particular reading in Aberdeen. A woman waited to speak to me at the end, or other people getting books, and then she really waited, and then she said, I just want to say before I go that your poem about death expressed something for me which was really important to me. And I was stunned speaking to her, thinking, I didn't read a poem about death. So what was I to do as a poet? Am I to say that? I don't think the reader's wrong, or the listener in that case, but what it is was her life experience and where she was at in her life found something in a poem that I'd written, which might have been had some emotional depth in it, but it was, she was obviously thinking about death or grieving, and it helped heal something for her. But it's not my place, because the magic of the poem works where the reader or the listener meets the poem. And I think that's something else we're very interested in, is the difference between the poem and the poet.
We are.
We're interested in so many things
We're
to do
interested
with
in everything.
poetry, yeah. But we've spoken about that before. But this podcast, so we can cover that in another podcast,
Yeah.
Ali. So this particular podcast, is there anything you are particularly wanting to do with this?
I think the thing that keeps coming back to me, with the podcast generally, do you mean?
Yeah,
just in
podcast
general.
generally,
I just want
yeah.
to I just want to be talking about poems that we love. I'm particularly interested in poems that we don't love.
I was going to say, what about the poems we hate?
The poems we hate.
And we're both aware when we say this that there will be people who do hate our poetry.
Absolutely.
Because we accept that. We accept
We
that.
hate
There's
our
nothing. We don't. But there is nothing, and I absolutely love Ali Whitelock's
Maggie's
poetry, which is why we've it was like a magnetic force pulling us together.
Absolutely. But I think the thing that I keep coming back to is I come across, as you do, as we all do, I think, poems that we read them and we're scratching our heads.
Yeah.
And we're asking ourselves, what are they saying? And we're not sure what they're saying. And so that's, I tend to find that I will read a list of prize-winning poems, and I'm often scratching my head, and I ask around poet friends, and what do you think of this and what do you think of that? And it's very often I don't know what they're talking about. I don't know why it won, and that's not to say there aren't some fantastic prize winners, clearly, but I guess that's one of the questions for me. It's what know.
And I'm sure one of the I'm sure someone somewhere will have said to you, "Oh, you can get notes in that poem."
Yeah.
Or so explains it, and it makes me think of because I've taught creative writing and poetry for actually frighteningly 40 years this year, and it makes me think of poems which people bring to workshops, and they start explaining, well, what I'm saying there is, and I have to say, but you're not actually saying it. And usually the group is in agreement, because usually we've all been unable to make much of a comment because no one actually knows what it's saying, which is why the poet starts to explain it. And sometimes I have said, I really don't want the poetry to be a cryptic crossword for me. And I used to do cryptic crosswords, and I love cryptic crosswords, but for me that sort of cryptic needing a key to open the poem is not inclusive, and it's not that inclusivity is everything. But what I want to do when I write is write poetry that virtually anyone can pick up and read.
Yeah, there's also that other side of the coin where if there's music and magic in the poem, then I can forgive all of the abstract intellectual stuff. There's a great essay by Clive James, and he talks about poetry. His collection of essays is about poetry, and in one of his essays he talks about a piece of a few stanzas from a poem, and he recites them, and they're very abstract, but at the end of that, at the end of the reading of the poem, he says, I have no idea what that poem is talking about, but I love how it makes me feel. So I can also forgive poems which are overly intellectual if there's this kind of magic. I don't always need to know what's going on, but for me it just can't be intellectual stuff alone without magic and music and those lines that just make, sort of take your breath away for whatever reason.
Yeah, when you say lines that take your breath away, though, you're probably talking about, well, I don't want to say for you what you're doing, but are you talking about imagery there, where the image, the combination of the language and the image is so powerful?
It can be that, can't it? It can be that, and it can also be that there is no image. I mean, it just depends, doesn't it? It can be that the language has been so sparse. My heart's bursting with, I don't even know what it's bursting with, but do you know?
Right,
so it can be that. It can be a very simple line. I'm trying to think of a line that I read the other day, and it was nothing, but it was everything, and I can't remember it, so that's ridiculous. But I'll look at that one.
Maybe that's what I was going to say. Maybe that's one we can come back to in one of our little podcasts. Can be on that type of thing, and we're here to learn as well. We learn from each other. And I am listening to what Ali is saying there, and I'm thinking maybe I've been too harsh in the past, and I need to open up my mind as well. And I'm perfectly willing to do that. That's part of the journey of poetry, part of the life journey of being a poet. And if the minute we've stopped doing that, there is actually a bit of a problem. You might as well just put your pen down.
Leave the room.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
And so we do have a little tagline for this podcast.
We do. It took us a week to come up with it.
It took us a week to come up with it, and we couldn't come up with for the title with anything more original than
what is it called again? Magi Ali's
Poetry Podcast.
Oh no, I think we settled on Magi Ali's Poetry
Show. That's it.
Magi Ali's Poetry Show. That's what it is. And we, as you can see, we think we've finally decided on a name for it.
Yeah. But the tagline, do you want to say a few words about the tagline?
Yeah, so our tagline was fuck mediocrity, we want risk. And I think the more that Maggie and I have looked at poems together and shared our thoughts on them, we think, why is this poem not working? And there's so many times where we've come to the conclusion it's because it's too safe. And so the poet hasn't been taking any risk. A lot of poets don't want to take risk, that's fine.
Yeah.
I like a bit of risk. And that's not to say, that's what I like. So I have sadly found that there are, a lot of poems that fit into that mediocrity.
Yeah, and I think sometimes too they're too derivative, and you can almost see the influence of other, particularly, it's not particularly even other poets, it's other poets' poetry that is around at the moment. And it does take some courage to break away from that and say, I don't give a flying fuck what poetry editors are looking for at the moment, or competition judges or anything else, because this is the poem I want to write, and I want to write it my way. And I had to get over this. You talked about Charles Bukowski helping you through thinking, you can write whatever you want. And my route to that point was much, much longer, because my mother was she was a wonderful woman, a very strong woman, working class woman, and no interest at all in books or writing, but she was very, very good at maths, although she'd left school at 13. But books and writing are a foreign country to her. And because she was so private, my mother is so private, it gets dark early in the winter in Scotland, and she would not put the big light, as we called it, on in the living room unless the curtains were already closed. So we had to close the curtains, then put the light on, because she was horrified. Not that there was anything terrible to see. She was horrified at the thought of people looking in, because she was a private person and she never gossiped. She didn't do that type of thing at all. She just kept herself to herself. And suddenly she's got this daughter who is writing poetry. Not that I told her, but she was writing. I was writing poetry and trying to think, I can't say that because it would upset my mother. It wasn't about annoying her or anything. I actually loved my mum and I didn't want her to be upset. But she eventually found the the
I mean,
poetry. But
you
I'll
do-
keep that story for
You
another
do
time.
hear a lot of writers talking about that very thing.
Yeah.
They may have written a memoir or some poetry, but they're going to wait until their parents or whichever person is no longer there before they would publish that. But going back to your earlier point, when you're talking about not writing to a theme, say, for a competition necessarily, or those kinds of things.
Or themes.
But I mean, Charles Bukowski does have a lovely quote about that, and he says, the minute that you're writing for an editor or a publisher, you're fucked.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was, I just...
So who do you write for?
Well, as I'm always sort of, banging on about, I'm only ever trying to please myself. Only ever.
Yes.
And if the poem is good enough for me, and I totally get that it might only be, interesting to one person in the world or, 5, I have to love it. I have to love it. And of course, we all love it. I mean, I don't think I'm saying anything, different to what anybody else would say about their own poems. I mean, surely we're writing them because we love them. But for me, it's almost as though when I'm writing a poem now, the end product, the poem, if we can call it a product, is no longer the point for me. The point of getting to the finished poem is the part where the most meat and deliciousness is for me. So I love the process of writing the poem itself. When it's finished, I feel a certain grief, and then I've got to look at the blank page again. But that, of course, then brings us into AI and how AI can produce poems that people think are actually very good. But what I'm not hearing people talk about is that, of course, takes away all of the juice and deliciousness for the poet. And surely that's got value, surely that's got, that kind of energy going out into the world must surely be a good thing.
Well, I mean, I think you would agree with me. One of the reasons that we don't, we both very dislike writing to a topic that we've been given. Obviously, our work falls into topics once it's written, and that's a different thing. So you might have a written poem, there might be a competition, and you think, oh, I have a poem that fits that. But if the minute you say you try to write to that topic, or write for the magazine, there's a call out, and they've said, well, we want poems on, well, if they're a terrible magazine, they're saying we want poems on spring. And it makes me want to write death poems. But the thing is that, we're writing from, and I think that the best poetry from everyone comes from not a topic, not a can you give me a poem on, as you would with AI. It comes from something inside you that you're needing to express, and it needs to come out. And then because you're a poet, rather than just someone who's writing a journal, wonderful things that they are, but you're writing it and you want it to be a poem. And that's where the hard work comes in, is to this thing which is insisting on being expressed, is to try to express it in a poem, which is it's a kind of package in a way, isn't it, which you feel really suits suits what this emotion. So it's much more complex than, if you want to say to AI, you can say I'd like a sonnet on grief, and it will give you something that approximates to it. But what has happened to that very human process, because remember, people have been writing poetry and doing similar to poetry, whether you go back to we've been writing poetry for thousands of years anyway, because we've got the ancient Greeks and there will be oral traditions in other cultures too. So this is a really, really human thing to want to do.
It's just like, going back to the point you just made about, this idea that's insisting on being expressed. I think that is a lovely way to put it. I think there are poems that come from that space. But I would also argue, I'm not going to argue very much. I would also say, because we're not in a debate, but I would just also, for me, I think there's also, I'll just have a bit of an idea, or I'll see an odd thing in the street,
odd things,
and then I'm not really, I'm almost like I start to mind that odd idea to see what it is I think about it, and
You're absolutely
how
right.
can I make this into a thing, you know? And so then the play begins, really, if we can call it play.
Yeah.
But so there's all sorts of ways, you know, poems can be expressed. Certainly Charles Bukowski, coming back to him again, he will say, if it's not coming out of you like a rocket, don't do it.
Yeah.
I don't subscribe to that at all.
No.
I wouldn't say I'm a plodder, but I write every day whether I feel like it or not, and certainly some days the work comes out and it's all right, and some days it's absolute shite, and every so often I go, oh, that's not too bad, you know. This is as good a thing as you can say about your own work. But predominantly, for me, I took away the mystique of writing. I'm not waiting for the magical muse to come from whatever.
Oh, have you ever had a muse? No.
I don't know.
No, I don't think I have.
No. I can hear about it.
Museless poets.
Yeah, and so it's just for me it's just work. So I take away all of that sort of, you know, fear that I might not be able to produce great work every day of my life. Certainly I don't. And actually Sharon Olds has got a great quote about that, and she said that, well, her quote is, I write as much crap as anyone else, which is also lovely and reassuring.
Yes, it is.
We're all writing crap.
But I mean, that would take us towards a craft, which maybe we shouldn't be, you know, covering today, because that's quite a lot we've covered today.
We've covered a lot today.
So I'm wondering if we should certainly get a fresh coffee and tea.
Oh, yeah.
Then the idea if the waiter is anywhere.
I think he's gone out.
So, and it has been an absolute delight.
Lovely.
Doing this first podcast with you, Ali.
Magi Ali show.
And oh yeah, the show. Sorry, I keep calling it a podcast.
Maybe it is a
start. But I mean, it really has. And this is the kind of thing Maggie, I'm getting my wrong name. Ali and I meet for coffee whenever we can. and this is the kind of talk we do, which is why we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to at least try?
Because
we might watch this and decide.
We might, but it's nourishing, and to have someone like Maggie, and to have access to someone like Maggie, if I can call it access, but to connect in a way the way in which we do so strongly around poetry and life and many other things. But it's, you know, as a writer, and we all write you know, in isolation, but to have someone that you can just email and message all night long, read this one, read that one, God, what do you think of that?
Oh, it's awesome. When Alice says that this
super.
is other people's poems we're reading.
Yeah.
We're not so prolific that we're producing, you know, 10 poems per night. In fact, I'm anything but prolific. Ali is a disciplined one, and I, you know, you write every day. I write in a different way, and of course I think that's part of why it works for us to chat and share, because we're actually coming at things in a very, very, very different way, and our work is, I would say, I mean, nobody would look at the work and think, oh, that's a Magi Gibson poem, and say that's like Ali Whitelock, or vice versa. Or if that is the case, I wasn't aware of it. But it's been very enriching for me to have met Ali some years ago now. I think 2018, Edinburgh. French-Scottish Poetry Library, and it was great. We'd known each other online for a while, and we'd known each other for a while online. But obviously, meeting then was fabulous for us. So thank you for joining us today.
Lovely, thanks. It was great.
And we shall go off, and you know what we're going to do? We're going to put the camera off, and then we're going to talk more about poetry.
More poetry, it's insane.
So, thank you for now.